On January 16, 2026, in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, Canada did something that would have seemed impossible just 12 months earlier. It struck a deal with China. Not a minor trade adjustment, not a diplomatic nod. A landmark agreement that slashed tariffs, reopened billion-dollar markets, and sent shockwaves through every trade ministry and auto plant from Detroit to Ottawa. And it did something else. It told the world that America's closest ally had decided it could no longer afford to wait for Washington. But here is the question that matters most. Was this a pivot away from the United States, or was it something more calculated, more strategic, and ultimately more consequential for everyone watching? To understand what happened in Beijing on January 16th, you have to go back further than the deal itself. You have to understand a crop. Canola is not a glamorous subject. It does not make headlines the way a missile test or a diplomatic incident might. But for the 40,000 Canadian farmers who grow it across the prairies of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, it is everything. Their income, their mortgages, their children's futures. The canola industry contributes $43.7 billion annually to the Canadian economy. That is more than Canada's steel, aluminum, and car manufacturing industries combined. And Canada exports roughly 90% of what it grows, making international market access not a preference but a lifeline. For decades, China was Canada's second largest canola buyer, purchasing approximately 5 million tons per year. In 2024 alone, Canadian canola seed, oil, and meal exports to China were worth $4.9 billion. The supply chain that moved that crop from prairie farms to Chinese cooking oil factories was one of the most reliable and lucrative agricultural trade corridors in the world. And then it collapsed. In the fall of 2024, Canada followed the United States and the European Union in imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Beijing responded methodically. In March 2025, China imposed 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil and meal, along with 25% tariffs on pork and seafood. In August 2025, it added a 75.8% provisional duty on canola seed itself. The effect was immediate and devastating. Not a single shipment of Saskatchewan canola seed, oil, or meal entered the Chinese market after those duties took effect. The Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce reported that canola futures fell $30 per ton in a single day after the seed tariff announcement, wiping approximately $610 million in value from Western Canadian farming in 24 hours. Yellow pea prices dropped 43% from their pre-tariff levels. Farmers were watching full grain bins, limited marketing options, and a growing sense that nobody in Ottawa was prioritizing their survival. One farmer near Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, speaking to the CBC in April 2025, said she was genuinely uncertain whether planting canola that season was even the right decision. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is a farm family staring at ruin. But here is the crucial detail that explains everything that followed. While Canadian farmers were bleeding from Chinese tariffs, the government in Ottawa was simultaneously absorbing escalating hostility from Washington. Trump's administration had imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods from early 2025 under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, later raising that rate to 35% for non-USMCA compliant goods. Steel and aluminum tariffs had been raised to 50%. Automotive tariffs of 25% had taken effect. Canada's trade talks with Washington had started and stalled and started again and stalled again. In October 2025, talks collapsed entirely when Trump was angered by an Ontario Commission television advertisement using Ronald Reagan's own words to criticize protectionism. Canada had come to Washington with concessions, with good faith, with gestures of cooperation. It had dropped most of its retaliatory tariffs. It had met its NATO defense spending commitment for the first time since the Cold War. It had tightened border security and suspended a digital services tax that irritated the White House. And in return, it was getting higher tariffs, collapsed negotiations, and a president who referred to its prime minister publicly as a governor. Mark Carney had spent months trying to stabilize a relationship that Washington seemed intent on destabilizing. The question that began forming in Ottawa was a simple one. How long do you wait? The answer arrived at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea in October 2025. On the sidelines, Carney met Chinese President Xi Jinping. It was the first official meeting between the leaders of Canada and China since 2017, a gap of 8 years during which the relationship had frozen, cracked, and hardened following the 2018 arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou on a U.S. extradition request, China's subsequent detention of 2 Canadian citizens, and years of diplomatic frost. Xi described the meeting as a turnaround. Both leaders directed their officials to begin resolving the trade irritants. And 3 months later, on January 16, 2026, Carney flew to Beijing with his delegation and Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, whose province produces more than half of Canada's total canola output. What emerged from 2 days of negotiations was a deal of genuine substance. Canada agreed to allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles per year into the Canadian market at a tariff rate of just 6.1%, down from the existing 100%. That quota was set to grow to 70,000 vehicles over 5 years. In exchange, China committed to lowering its tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 84% down to approximately 15% by March 1, 2026. Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas were to be removed entirely until at least the end of 2026. The deal would unlock nearly $3 billion in export orders for Canadian farmers, fish harvesters, and processors. Carney described it as a partnership that reflected the world as it is today. Saskatchewan Premier Moe, who had been watching his province's farmers suffer for nearly a year, called it a very positive day for Canada-China relations and a positive day for the agriculture industry in Canada. But what did Washington make of all this? The answer was revealing precisely because it was inconsistent. Trump's first public response was almost supportive. When asked by reporters on January 16th, he said, "If you can get a deal with China, you should do that. That is okay." It seemed for a brief moment that the administration had decided to shrug this one off. It was not to last. Within days, the tone changed sharply. On January 24th, Trump posted to his Truth Social platform that if Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the United States. He accused Carney of trying to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods into the American market, and referred to the Canadian Prime Minister as governor, a deliberate diminishment that had become a fixture of Trump's approach to Canada. The U.S. Trade Representative warned Canada would regret the decision. Transportation officials called it a mistake. The Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association expressed concern about the EV component, warning that Canada's broader economy would be at severe risk if the deal threatened its relationship with American markets. And analysts began running the numbers on what a 100% tariff on all Canadian exports to the United States would actually mean for both countries. For Canada, which still sends roughly 70% of its exports south, the damage would be catastrophic. But economists also noted that a 100% tariff on Canadian goods would immediately raise American inflation by an estimated 1.5 to 2%, given Canada's role as the largest supplier of U.S. energy imports, the primary source of crude oil for American Gulf Coast refineries, and a deeply embedded partner in automotive supply chains, where components cross the border up to 8 times before a single vehicle is completed. It would not be a punishment inflicted on Canada alone. It would be a self-inflicted wound on the American economy. Carney responded with deliberate composure. Canada, he said, had no intention of pursuing a formal free trade agreement with China. The deal was entirely consistent with Canada's obligations under the USMCA. Its purpose was to rectify trade issues that had developed over recent years, not to realign Canadian foreign policy. And on the central question of whether Canada would ever become a conduit for Chinese goods entering American markets, Carney's government pointed to the deal's structure, a capped quota of 49,000 vehicles, not a blanket reduction. Guardrails, not a gateway. What the Beijing deal actually represented, stripped of the political noise surrounding it, was a calculated act of portfolio management by a country that had been forced to reckon with the risks of putting nearly all its economic eggs in one basket. Jerome Gesaroli, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, framed it with precision in a subsequent analysis. Ottawa was not naively embracing China, he wrote. It was responding to two simultaneous pressures, an increasingly hostile and unpredictable United States and a Chinese market that had demonstrated its willingness to weaponize Canadian agricultural access for political leverage. The deal did not signal a strategic pivot away from Washington. It signaled that Canada had decided it could not enter the USMCA review in July 2026 without any cushion at all. Canada's defense and intelligence ties remain deeply interwoven with the United States. Its largest trading relationship by an enormous margin remains American. Carney himself told reporters in Beijing that Canada's relationship with the United States was more multifaceted and much deeper than its relationship with China. But he also said something else that cut to the heart of the matter. He was asked directly whether China had become a more predictable and reliable partner than the United States. His answer was careful and precise. In terms of the way our relationship has progressed in recent months with China, he said, it is more predictable. That single word landed like a verdict. Not that China was a better partner, not that Canada preferred Beijing to Washington, but that at this particular moment, under this particular American president, Beijing was offering something Washington was not: predictability. And in global trade, predictability is worth more than almost anything else. The immediate geopolitical stakes of the Beijing deal extended well beyond canola and electric vehicles. China had been watching the deterioration of Washington's relationships with its traditional allies with considerable strategic interest. Beijing understood that Trump's pressure tactics on allies like Canada were creating openings. A Tsinghua University analyst quoted by Al Jazeera following the deal's announcement put it plainly: if Ottawa took a more pragmatic and autonomous economic policy toward China, Beijing could point to it as evidence that American-led economic decoupling was neither inevitable nor universally accepted among America's closest partners. That framing matters. It is not that Canada's deal with China transformed the global order. It is that it gave Beijing a concrete, irrefutable example to point to when arguing that countries have a choice. And the argument that countries have a choice is precisely what undermines the American strategy of building coalitions of like-minded allies who maintain unified fronts on China policy. The USMCA review, scheduled for July 2026, now carries a burden it was never designed to bear. What began as a routine 6-year review of a trade agreement has become something far more consequential. The CSIS analysis published in March 2026 described the review as unfolding less as a traditional trade update and more as a negotiation over security architecture. Washington's position, as articulated by U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, is that any deep economic integration within North America must come with coordinated external barriers toward common adversaries, chiefly China. Canada's deal with Beijing moved in precisely the opposite direction, and Carney has declined to say publicly whether he would agree to align Canadian trade policy with American policy on China as part of the USMCA negotiations. He is, as he told reporters, not inclined to negotiate in public. That phrase carries a strategy within it. It means Carney has not closed that door, but it also means he has not opened it. What the coming months will reveal is whether the American administration, which has repeatedly treated economic coercion as its primary foreign policy instrument, is capable of offering Canada enough in return for that alignment to make it worth the domestic political cost. Canada entered 2026 being squeezed from two directions. By January 16th, it had opened a third door. The story of what happened in Beijing is ultimately a story about what happens when a country that has been exposed to too much risk from a single relationship is left with no good options and chooses the least bad one. Canada did not sign a deal with China because it wanted to become China's partner. It signed a deal with China because 40,000 canola farmers had watched a year's harvest sit unsold in bins, because pea prices had fallen 43%, because trade talks with Washington had collapsed over a television advertisement, and because the July 2026 USMCA review was approaching with no progress and no clarity. The deal unlocked $3 billion in agricultural export orders. It set a cap on Chinese EV imports at 49,000 vehicles, a number that mirrors pre-tariff levels. It opened dialogue on energy cooperation, a category that could carry far larger long-term implications if it develops, though at the time of writing that remains a declared intention rather than a concrete arrangement. What it did not do is what some in Washington feared most. It did not sever Canada's fundamental orientation toward the West. It did not establish a free trade agreement with a non-market economy. It did not turn Canada into a backdoor for Chinese goods entering American markets. What it did do is something more durable and more significant. It demonstrated that Canada had developed the capacity to act independently, to make consequential decisions without Washington's permission, and to manage its own interests in a world that had stopped behaving the way the textbooks said it would. Whether that capability is used to strengthen the eventual USMCA negotiation or to signal a longer-term restructuring of Canadian foreign economic policy is a question that July 2026 will begin to answer. What is already clear is that the assumptions that govern North American trade for 30 years, that Canada would follow America's lead, that economic integration meant political alignment, that the relationship was too deep to be tested from within, have been permanently altered. The world Carney walked into when he became Prime Minister in March 2025 is not the world that produced those assumptions. And the deal he signed in Beijing was the clearest signal yet that he knows it.